Namaskar and welcome to DD Dialogue on the G20. The Group of 20 Nations is the premier multilateral forum for global economic governance, and India's presence of the G20 has been much discussed and much elaborated and explained by scholars as well as thinkers. On Doordarshan, India's national broadcaster, we are very, very privileged to have none other than India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Subrahmanyam Jaishankar, joining us to throw light on India's presence of the G20, what's happening to the G20 as an institution, global governance, multilateralism. We're going to be talking about all these aspects, viewers. It's a real treat for us. I want to welcome Dr. Jaishankar for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Sreeram ji. Always good to be on Doordarshan. Always good to be with you.
Thank you, sir. So the G20 India Way, when we say it is playing upon the title of your own book, The India Way, which is an international bestseller, has been read widely and translated into so many languages. It's in many ways become the introduction to Indian foreign policy for most people around the world. And a sizable portion of the book you have devoted to our commitment to multilateralism and to our ethos of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and all these things. So we'd like you to start, Dr. Jaishankar, by talking about what is it about the India way and the Indian ethos, and how does it, what is the congruence with the G20? Because this is the 18th summit that we are hosting in 2023. Many countries have done prior to us and will continue and take over the baton from us. But this moment, 2023, is so special. And how does it tie to the India ethos and the India way, sir?
Well, it's interesting that you made that connection because, you know, to me, India Way had three concepts. One was, it was very important to understand the larger environment, the global environment. The second was that, in a way, within that environment, how do you focus on priorities? How do you select priorities? How do you define priorities? And the third is, how do you actually get it done, which is the Indian way, you may say. So look at the three of them. Why is our presidency of the G20 important? The first reason is the environment. That the world environment today is very difficult. You have a very sharp east-west polarization. You have very big north-south divides, gaps. Which have grown during this COVID period due to and aggravated by conflicts. The second is, within this larger universe of problems, what are the priorities? And we have focused on the priorities using the concept of global south. That the key priorities today in the world are sustainable development growth. How do you maintain it? How do you ensure it doesn't regress? How do you today ensure the resources for green development? How do you ensure that there is the digital opportunities are not missed by many countries? So you make, in a sense, a key set of issues. And finally, what has been different the way we have done it, and I think a lot of it derives from Prime Minister Modi's belief in Jan Bhagidari, that typically conferences in this country, even big conferences, and I've seen quite a few in my own times, big conferences frankly used to take place in Vigyan Bhavan, and its impact zone was about 1 kilometer in either direction of Vigyan Bhavan. The idea that you can actually take opportunity for leadership and for bringing, you know, your summoning powers, your influence, and have this become a participative exercise, that to do it in 60 cities, to do it in every state and union territory, to involve people. I mean, if you look at it today, you know, the youth of the country is involved, you know, scientists of the country are involved, academicians are involved, cultural figures are involved. So there is actually a sense today of popular involvement, which to me is a very, very new experience. I've never seen, I mean, in 45 years, I've never seen something like this.
The world has never seen this kind of G20, says Dr. Jaishankar. And so the question of people's participation, I want to just stretch it a little further and ask you about what is it you've been observing, India and writing about India for so long, and now you are a major policy maker, Indians as a people have really taken the ownership and the stakeholdership of this G20. And we have seen, you know, at least 15 million people formally associated with the events, and several, you know, times more people taking an active interest in it.
Absolutely.
And everyone knows the G20 is about global governance, global leadership, taking responsibilities. So we'd like you to reflect on why you think this juncture in history, why we seem to be ready for global leadership as a people and as a society.
Well, I would say, especially in the last decade, there have been multiple realizations in the country, in our society. One, for a variety of reasons, people believe today that the world matters much more to their daily lives, to their challenges, to their opportunities. They're both, I would say, good and not so good reasons for it. They see, you know, for example, today the opportunities of the world, travel, tourism, workplace, technology, all of that is there. At the same time, they've also seen during COVID that something that started in another city, you know, to our north, far away, came back and completely took over our lives. So I would say the average person intuitively today is far more globalized. It's also because we today, the screen time we all spend is so much more. We get up in the morning and our first reaction is really, what is it that I have missed when I was sleeping? So there's a natural inclination to reach out to the world, and you know, it's become internalized with all of us here. And perhaps, and I would say it is across location, it is across generation, it is across profession, it is across income, so that connection with the world. The second, I would say, is also a stronger sense of capability and contribution. The feeling that we Indians, we make a difference. That when we see, you know, it could be the fact that when you see our own ability to secure our students in Ukraine, or the fact that you go out to an earthquake in Turkey and are among the early responders, or the fact that, you know, there's a successful Chandrayaan-3 mission. So the belief in this country that we can do more, we should be doing more, and that's very interesting because, you know, in many societies actually, societies are retracting, that they are turning inwards. Whereas I think today what is different about India is especially the younger generation, I would say, far more globalized, far more optimistic. It's also in some ways an outcome of our demographics that for us today the world will be a growing workplace, that an era of a knowledge economy will require the movement in the mobility of talent and skills. So people see that today. I mean, it could be different professions. You see many more Indians traversing around the world, and the younger generation doesn't see that as a challenge. You know, someone say, when I was starting off my work life, to me, I would have probably been intimidated at the idea of going out. You know, that's not the case. I mean, people deal with it much more naturally. Yeah,
so we are much more comfortable with the idea of India being at the center of the world, cynosure of all eyes. And
I would say, Sreeram, we are much more confident. We are much more confident about ourselves. I think the last decade, what we have done has given that feeling to society. I mean, see, even in adversity, I mean, there are societies which have been really shattered by COVID. I mean, they're still picking up the pieces, they're still feeling the pain. Whereas you look at the resilience in India, you know, that sense, yes, it was traumatic, but we set up the systems, we could respond to it, we created our vaccine, we were able to get, you know, the biggest vaccination program in the world done.
And so the credibility on the world stage, and especially at the G20 in the multilateral fora, also derive from the domestic strengths, isn't it? I mean, these are not really, you can't compartmentalize them. And so what you're saying is that we are also being taken much more seriously because of this, the accumulation of achievements in governance. And you've also often spoken about how our domestic attributes are now, becoming international preferences. That is the sign of a rising power, especially at G20s.
You are absolutely right. Today, as I said at the start, we have these two big contradictions, if you would, the East-West polarization, the North-South divide. And we have that ability today to bridge this. But even if you look at a bridge, sometimes the credibility of the bridge is also an issue. A country which has delivered today so strongly, when I go out in the world and it may interest your viewers to know, a lot of the conversations I have, they're not about Indian foreign policy. They're actually about Indian domestic happenings. People want to know, for example, how did you get a CoWIN platform done? How are you doing your own 5G stack? Who are these people who managed a Chandrayaan landing close to the South Pole? So there's an enormous curiosity in the world today, and I would say a growing respect in the world today about what it is that India has managed to do in the last decade. So when we tell people, and our numbers by any standards are mind-boggling. When you tell people, look, we don't worry, during that period, we actually, despite all those apocalyptic predictions about us, we actually kept up, food support for such a large number, 800 million people, that through financial support to the most vulnerable, even something like Mudra loans. When you throw numbers like, this scheme is 400 million, that scheme is 500 million, food support is 800 million, houses are the beneficiaries, the family members put together is 150 million. I think the world is waking up to the fact, and they probably, if I were to single out one particular aspect of what we are doing, it is the digital. That our digital delivery, I think, is evoking a lot of respect. When you talk to people about cashless transactions, we are today, 40 times the number of the US. In terms of what we do. It tells you what the digital embrace has been. So to me, one aspect, or very important aspect of this G20 is that from a perception in the world of an argumentative India, I think today we have become the delivery India, that this is a credible India, this is a actionable India.
Absolutely. Dr. Jaishankar, now coming to the diplomacy part, your ministry and your staff are, I think, burning the proverbial midnight oil simply to get everything in place for the summit.
We're not burning that oil. That's a politically very incorrect statement. We are getting solar and storing it, but
it's a renewable energy. Yes, India's renewable energy. So on this matter, every host tries to find a commonality and bring these differing viewpoints and to kind of consensus with a joint statement, joint communique. And more important than just a piece of paper which everybody will sign at the summit, it's also about the agenda going forward. And on this, India is famed to be this bridge, the credible bridge, as you said. So is there at least one thematic area you'd like to talk about in particular where we have been able to reduce the differences and create some kind of a common ground for the G20? Obviously, the chair has a very critical role to bring the flock together. So if you'd like to throw light on one or two areas of the G20 this year.
I don't want to jump the gun. I think we have to wait till the 10th of September to see what the outcomes are. But rather than talk about a theme, when I said that there's an environment and then there are priorities, I want to emphasize the priorities. These words, Global South, we have definitely managed to get it on the lexicon of global diplomacy today. When we first started using it and pressing that word at the beginning of this year, there are a lot of raised eyebrows across the world. Today I see more and more countries using it. But I think more than the lexicon or the dictionary of diplomacy, we have managed to get it on the conscience of the world. That we have managed to take, when you say global south, what are we talking about? We are talking today of debt, of food prices, of energy prices, of the ability to provide resources for education and nutrition and health, of affordable, accessible health, of not just setting ambitious targets, which are very much easier to do, but of providing resources, to assured resources to reach that. So there are a whole set of issues today. When the moment you say the focus is on global south, from that directly there are a set of focus issues that come. The focus issues are exactly what I lay out to you. So this, to my mind, will be really what the G20 will be looking at. I mean, the G20 will be looking at, how do you today deal with the debt predicament of so many countries? How do you deal with the fact that sustainable development goals have actually regressed in the last few years because of the
pandemic and the war,
because of the pandemic and the conflict. They will be dealing with issues like food and fertilizer and and sometimes you're right. Often people think these are words, but many words have very practical consequences. If you look at this initiative of the Prime Minister of propagating millets, do just reflect for a moment. I'm only giving you India's case. Now this can have global consequences. In a country like India, we produce roughly 17% millets to the wheat production. So roughly, if wheat production is 100, millet production is 16, 17, something like that. Now millets are produced in smaller land holdings, drier land holdings, use less water, typically produced by the small farmer. The problem is a lot of them are consumed on site. They are not marketed because there's no awareness, there's no demand. Now if you see the last year, the millet campaign, what you will see is that if you are going to increase grain production, here is a large untapped possibility. And when you travel around the world, for example, I've seen in Africa, a lot of African countries actually have grown up eating millets, by the way, just like we did. In our own lives, younger people would be surprised to know wheat really came in a big way in 1960s and 70s. That many parts of India, even today, have if not memories, certainly still have practice of millet consumption. So that's a very practical, you can say, okay, there's a campaign called International Year of Millets. Now I'll give you another example. This initiative of Prime Ministers called LIFE, Lifestyle for Environmental, Lifestyle for Environment. Now the fact is, there are so many daily practices which we can build into our lives, which actually would have a impact on the environment. So it isn't, we should not reduce the climate action debate to a kind of a coal fundamentalism or a fossil fundamentalism. That is one aspect. That is
the
not,
emissions side.
But there are so many other aspects to it. So. Right. And finally, a lot of it is today about resources. That how do we, it's not that there are no resources in the world. We have seen in other situations, the same amount of resources which may not be available for climate action may suddenly be mobilized for some other cause. So it's possible. So how do we deal with that resources problem more seriously?
Very much. These are all the key problems of the global south, and India has been highlighting those at the G20, says Dr. Jaishankar. So coming to the question of multilateralism now, Prime Minister Modi has said at the G20 foreign ministers meeting, I quote, multilateralism is in a state of crisis, global governance has failed. And he tasked the G20 to try and revive the confidence in multilateralism, the very idea that 15-20 also can get together and do something together for the sake of the the wretched of the earth, so to say. That have we been able to infuse that especially among the richer countries? This is always a question we have in India, sir, because of the north-south divide you spoke about. And how do we do it as chair of G20 to convince them that, look, the non-members, the ones who are outside the G20 corridors also matter?
Look, let me make 2 points here. One, international relations is both competitive and collaborative, by its nature.
Sure.
G20 is the kind of forum where the expectation of the world is that the collaborative phase, the collaborative instincts would be much, much stronger than the competitive instincts. Okay. So this is a time where every G20 member feels that responsibility, that what they decide when they come here, the directions they set, the understandings they reach, the concepts which they propagate, these have long-lasting consequences. Okay. In a way, today you can say, because the G20 is far more contemporary, because it's 20 years, give or take, as a forum, as opposed to, say, the UN, which is 4 times that age. Because it is contemporary, because it is more broad-based, I think the responsibility, you can truly say today that it is the premier multilateral forum.
Absolutely.
And therefore the responsibility on this forum is that much more. And that is really what we will see come into play on the 9th and 10th of September, which is these 20 countries and the 9 guest countries and the international organizations actually having that belief that what they will agree on is very, very crucial. They may have the differences among them, but that's for a moment kind of to be dealt with in the right forum, in the right situation, in another way. The second point I would make, look, yes, I'm shining the spotlight on Global South. I'm using the Global South as a concept to highlight a whole set of problems which to the to the mind of the world are the real remit of the G20. The G20 is supposed to be all about global growth and development. But I want to make one point. This is not, it's not a problem of the Global South in itself. Anything which happens in the Global South, in a globalized world, let me tell you, will affect the Global North as well. It's not, there's no firewall. I mean, Europe has discovered that, for example, when it has come to, challenges in Africa, or, today it could be a climate catastrophe, it could be a conflict, it could be, we don't know, food crisis. Any major crisis today, it is no longer to keep it within a sort of a firewalled
silo
enclosure. I think everything today has global implications, and nothing reminds us more strongly of that than COVID. But it actually showed you, COVID was such a stark reminder today of how much mobility there is today in the world.
Problems.
So we are all in it together. This is not just Global South has a problem, so Global North comes and says, okay, let me see what I can do to the best of my ability. I think their necks are equally on the line on this one.
Yeah, so the interests are intertwined because of the interdependence.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Dr. Jaishankar, last question before I bring in the audience.
Sure.
We have been talking about the South as our main pillar of our G20 agenda. Now there is a quartet of sorts. We took over from Indonesia, then India 23, then Brazil 24, and then South Africa 2025. 4 years, this extended spell of G20 leadership under developing countries. Do you think that will help in a way to steer the institution and even broader the world order and multilateralism in a more desirable and more ethical and more just direction? Because ultimately that is our objective, isn't it, as chair, to steer the entire international discourse and deliberation and decision making in a fairer and more equitable manner?
Yes, I think that's a valid point. This, of course, was a complete coincidence that the flow happened this particular way. But you must also bear in mind that in the G20, there's a culture of a troika, that the previous chair, the current chair, and the next chair. So, for example, we would be the previous chair in the Brazilian presidency, like we were the future chair in the Indonesian presidency. So there's a continuum, if you would, out here. It also, I think, is helpful that India, Brazil, and South Africa, we have our own grouping, IPSA, as countries who want to see a more democratized, fairer, a more equitable, more inclusive world. It is very much part of that. And my own sense is, that inclusiveness, which has been so much at the center of the vision of the government, especially in the last decade in India. I think to varying degrees that also has impacted outside. Many of these governments and countries have a natural sort of resonance, partiality towards that. We, of course, as I said, because we have not just spoken about inclusiveness but have delivered on the ground, I think that is also something which is impacting people's thinking. So the combination of all of this, I think, bodes well for the direction of the G20. But what is most important right now is that in New Delhi, in the coming week, that all 20 countries come together with the fullest sense of responsibility, understand today how critical the global situation is, how many parts, how many regions of the world are actually looking towards the G20.
Yes.
And the fact that we did the Voice of Global South Summit, consulted 125 countries, are putting their issues on the table because they are physically not there at the table. The fact that we have taken the lead in advocating the permanent membership of the African Union in the G20, I think all these are in a way a direction in which the G20 should go, and I'm very confident that the countries coming after us will see it in a very similar light.
So viewers, Dr. Jaishankar, our External Affairs Ministry, is saying that there is a clear carry forward of Indian ideas that will continue. So the legacy of our G20 presidency is going to be lasting. We have no doubt about it. Now we have a very knowledgeable audience here in the Doordarshan studio joining us, and we have time for a few questions. May I invite Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia to start. He is a former Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs and former Indian Foreign Service officer.
Thank you very much. We all stand to benefit from this wonderful conversation. I just have a small question. Africanists of India are very pleased with the continuing focus that the government has given on the cause of the Global South. And it seems to us that we are very close to attaining one of the goals, which is to get African Union membership of G20. Are there still some holdouts, and if so, are we working strongly on them in the next few days to simply secure that goal? Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Let me make two comments here. One, in many ways, I think the focus on Africa, on putting forward the cause of the Global South, I think it's a very natural external reflection of how the Modi government thinks within the country. That if your fundamental domestic policy is leave no one behind, that same leave no one behind also applies beyond your borders. So, to me, there are two sides of the same coin, and I would say the importance of social justice is as crucial to me in international relations as it is in domestic policy. Regarding the AU permanent membership of the G20, I think we are very confident that this will happen at the summit. there are always processes to be gone through, but I would say that I'm pretty confident on this matter.
Thank you. Let me now request Professor Silvia Bottega. She is an Italian, and Italy, of course, is a G20 member state. So, Professor Bottega.
Good morning, Dr. Jaishankar. Yes, I would like to ask you if in the agenda of this G20 there is an important, I think, question that probably India should more promote. For instance, creating or pushing more a regional form of economic cooperation in Asia, like there are, for instance, in Africa. There are many regional organizations below the African Union, like the South African Development Cooperation, ECOWAS, and others. You know, what role India can play in this promoting, pushing for an economic cooperation like institutionalized beyond the BRICS, beyond forms of groupings, or like revitalizing the SARC forms like ASEAN, for instance, or other forms, for having this kind of confidence and attracting investment, which can really support the global South.
Thank you. At this time, I think it's natural for the G20 to look at policies and measures which would revitalize economic growth. That is very, very badly needed. Now, how to revitalize that has many aspects of it. As I said, one very important part of it is to address, for example, the debt situations of many countries. Another aspect of it is to give them the resources so that they're not resource starved as they're coming out of a COVID situation, which is the case with many of them. Your particular observation that, can the G20 get involved in creating regional architectures, that's not really the remit of G20, because that's for the regions or the nations of a particular region to do. I mean, for example, we've just come out of a BRICS summit, and the BRICS countries decided that we will do a few more things, and we will also consider expanding the membership. But it's not an issue which we would really bring into the G20, because the composition of the G20 is very, very different. But I do understand the underlying message in your question, which is are there ways by which, say, for example, can connectivity be promoted? I think there would be a lot of interest in looking at that. So there would be a whole set of issues which may not, which directly or indirectly may feed into growth and development. And I think that family of issues would really be the core agenda of what we are looking at.
Right. We have time for just one last question. May I request Professor Swaran Singh, noted scholar, please.
Thank you. First of all, of course, compliments and congratulations for making 18th G20 unprecedented. Several firsts, dozens of firsts in 2023. My question flows from your initial remarks, which continued also in other rest of the conversation, of the growing polarization in East and West, and of course the divide of North and South that you mentioned. We understand now that for understandable reasons, President Putin and President Xi Jinping are perhaps not joining the summit meeting. How does that impact the role of playing the bridge in this growing polarization and divide, especially when we have still 81 days? India's presidency continues for 81 days beyond the summit meeting. Is that space something that you have in mind where that reinforcement could happen?
Thank you.
You know, Professor, at the end of the day, countries are represented by whoever they have chosen to represent them. So the levels of representations, do not become the final determinant of the position of a country. So, even we, there are occasions where sometimes, let us say, Prime Minister may go. There are occasions he may not go for whatever reason. So I would say rather than focus necessarily on who, which country chose to come at what level, the real issue is what position do they take when they come. That's really, finally, what is it we will remember this G20 for? We will remember this G20 for the outcomes it produced, for the fact that it suggested solutions or concepts or action avenues that were relevant to the key burning issues of the day. So for me, what is really important is more the willingness and the I would say the enthusiasm of countries, the focus of countries to actually address these key issues. As I said, I have every expectation that they would, do that in a very responsible manner, understanding today the gravity of the international situation. The other part of it, of course, is within our own country, because what it has done. I mean, the G20 actually has given me also an opportunity to travel around, see other G20 events, assess how people have responded to it. I actually have seen a huge spike in, and this, Professor, should be good for you, huge spike in the interest in international affairs. That, young people today have become so much more involved with what is happening in the world. They knew it intuitively, but it was one thing to see that, it's another thing to have a connect, to have a sense of ownership, to feel a sense of pride, and I must also say, it'll be very interesting to see what are even the short-term and medium-term consequences of the G20. That, will we see, for example, there are many more places in India which have shown up in the radar of global tourism. So will we see more tourists there? Will there be in different domains? Will scientists of other G20 countries know more of their Indian counterparts and therefore take forward more projects with them? Quite possible. We've had civil society engagements. So do our NGOs or labor, do our trade unions get more connected? So I think because we have taken such a sort of broad participative approach to G20, not only to the official meetings, even to the engagement groups, I think you're going to see a lot come out of this G20 beyond these outcomes. But I'm very confident, whatever the levels of representation that every G20 member will come to this meeting very, very seriously, very much in the mode that they have to make their contribution to what is an important inflection point today in global politics.
Inflection point, Dr. Jaishankar says, and viewers, the point is that this is a historic moment, there's no doubt about it, and India stepped up the plate and is trying to hold the ship together. There are a lot of challenges, there's no question. Dr. Jaishankar is dealing with a lot of them, but he's still, bravely plowing ahead, because that's the nature of the world and of leadership. Leadership is always about facing big challenges, and India is trying to show
I have the goodwill of 1.4 billion Indians, so it's easy to plow ahead with all of that.
And viewers, I just wanted to mention, Dr. Jaishankar said that through G20 presidency, we are making India ready for the world, and it's happening. And I think that's a very significant point, because if 1.4 billion people, like you said, have this consciousness about the world, and international affairs becomes, a second nature to our own people, then we produce the thought leadership and the ideas that will then take us to the next level in terms of solving global problems. I want to thank Honorable External Affairs Ministers and this great audience for joining us today. It's a, G20 is like a, red letter mark for our country, and we are trying to do our utmost to try and resolve the enormous challenges that the world faces. All power to Dr. Jaishankar and his team. We hope that this G20 summit goes off smoothly and as expected, and it also generates those far long impact that we are looking for, because ultimately the world will only change if institutions are strong, and we are trying to strengthen global institutions. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. May I have standing applause from the audience, please?
Thank you.
परित्राणाय साधूनां विनाशाय च दुष्कृतां